Doris, Elbow Bump. How are you? Are you doing okay? Is your family okay? Remember, if you need anything, please send me an email and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. So lucky you, you get to hear my voice for another lecture. But the best part is we will be discussing how to reduce error by preparing for our studies from the beginning. Yay! In the last video, we discussed how the statistical process is similar to the scientific process. Every statistical analysis follows a linear pattern called the statistical process. This always happens in the same order. The statistical process is a major component of statistics, so we will be discussing this process throughout the course over and over again. I will refer to it in many different lectures. The purpose of the process is to reduce the amount of error in the study. I want to go into the first stage of the process, the question stage, in more depth today. This way you can see how from the beginning we start to remove any factors that might contribute to error by the end of our study. The first step or phase of the statistical process is the question phase. In this phase, there are a few things that you need to do. First, you need to establish what the question is that you want to answer about the population and the population parameter. If you're doing a null hypothesis study, you'll also try to find out what the status quo is for the population, what is expected. We'll go over null hypothesis testing towards the end of Stats B. Also, you want to make sure that you identify the population and the sample. During the question phase, we also want to make sure that we have a sound experimental design. We identify the variables we want to measure. We select any instruments that we might need to measure these variables, and we start looking to see which tests are most effective to answer the question. There is one word that I've used many times in the lectures, but I haven't defined yet. I want to do that now. The word is data. Data are characteristics or measurements that are collected through observation. In a more technical sense, data is a set of values of either qualitative or quantitative variables about one or more persons or objects. It's important to mention that the word data can be used for one piece of data or for many pieces of data. In other words, data is both singular and plural. The entire topic of types of data will be discussed in another video. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to discuss two types of data: qualitative data and quantitative data. Qualitative data or categorical data describe qualities about that particular person or thing. These qualities cannot be measured on a numerical scale. They can only be classified into categories. Many times, they describe demographic information like gender, race, grade level, neighborhood, subject, college major, etc. Qualitative data is often numerically coded for statistical purposes, but it never represents a quantity. You cannot perform arithmetic operations on qualitative data, cannot produce meaningful results. Quantitative data are measurements that are measured on a numerical scale, and they actually describe a quantity of that measurement. So for example, age, height, weight, points, distance, time, that would all be quantitative data because they all describe an amount. Because these measurements describe a quantity, you can perform arithmetic operations on this data. You can add, subtract, multiply, or divide these values. By performing these operations, you can produce meaningful results for your analysis. As you continue to prepare for your study, you're going to have to decide what you want to measure. The qualitative and quantitative information that you will take in will be either qualitative and quantitative variables. Variables are characteristics of interest that you want to measure for each individual in your sample. Variables are presumed to vary. Sometimes a variable can be constant, meaning that all of the cases or individuals in your sample have the same measure. In this case, the variable happens to be a constant and it will not vary. Let's look at an example. Here is a spreadsheet of third grade reading scores. So in this spreadsheet, we have 8 cases. We have student 1, student 2, student 3, student 4, student 5, student 6, student 7, student 8. And for each one of these individuals, we have collected information about each. Here, we collected information about their gender, about their grade, who their teacher is, and the test scores for 3 tests. In this situation, we have 8 cases and 6 variables. When we look at the variables, we can see that gender describes a quality about the student. Therefore, gender is a qualitative variable. Notice that these have numbers. The reason they have numbers is because the researcher has decided to code the genders. When there has been coding, there is usually a code book that will tell you what the various codes mean. So here they have the gender as 0 is male and 1 is female. As an aside, usually the codes include the number 0. They start with the number 0. So here, student 1 is female, student 2 is male, and so on. For the grade, it appears that only third graders were used in the study. So this variable happens to be a constant. There really wouldn't be a need to include this information in the spreadsheet, but the researcher has gone ahead and done so. The next variable is teacher. The students in the study might have one of 3 possible teachers as their reading teacher. The teacher variable is also qualitative because it describes a characteristic. It describes that person's name. Test 1, 2, and 3 describe a quantity, so they are quantitative variables. In this case, it describes how many points a student obtained in each one of those tests. So it measures the amount of points. In this situation, we have 6 variables, but one of them is really a constant. So this information we could just leave out and have 5 variables because really those are the things that are going to vary. For the most part, and I would say 99.9% of the time, variables constitute the columns of a spreadsheet. The cases or individuals constitute the rows of a spreadsheet. In the point of intersection, where the variable intersects with the case, that is an observation. So if I have 8 cases and 6 variables, I have 48 observations. So here is a summary. Here there are 8 cases because I have 8 rows. There are 6 variables, but really only 5 of them vary. One of them is a constant, so we could choose just not to put that in there. Maybe at some point they will vary. Maybe you're studying these children for a long period of time, and so the grade might change, but at this point it's just really a constant. There are 48 observations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times 8 is 48. And the intersection of the row and the column counts as an observation. Gender, grade, and teacher are all qualitative variables. The researcher has decided to code the gender variable, and they put the information in a code book at the bottom of the sheet. Test scores for test 1, test 2, and test 3 are quantitative variables because they describe an amount, in this case, an amount of points that the students earned on each one of the tests. Once we've decided what kind of data will be useful, there are also other factors to consider. We need to identify individuals that might have the same characteristics as the population where we can draw a sample. We need to have an effective sample size. We have to decide on how we're going to gather that data, what type of sampling technique we will use. We need to decide what kind of instruments we will need in order to gather the data. We have to decide what type of test is best suited for the research and what type of risks are assumed. And also we need to decide if we will need permission from an organization in order to conduct the experiment. All these decisions are made in advance in order to minimize error. Recent studies have shown that about 45% of everybody that lives in the United States has vitamin D deficiency. What we want to do in our study is we just want to look to see what proportion of women have vitamin D deficiency. Now we expect it might be about 45, that proportion would be spread out evenly between genders, but we don't know. So that's what we're going to look at. One thing I've always found interesting about vitamin D is it's called the sunshine vitamin. When your skin is exposed to sunlight, it makes vitamin D from the cholesterol in your body. The sun's ultraviolet B, UVB rays, hit the cholesterol in the skin cells, providing the energy for vitamin D synthesis to occur. So I've always thought that was kind of cool how the sun is actually making vitamin D for you and it makes you healthy. I just think that's just pretty amazing. Vitamin D is important in everyone's health. People that have a low level of vitamin D have greater risk of heart attacks, heart failure, stroke, diabetes, and high blood pressure later in life. Vitamin D is especially important in women because it can cause problems with pregnancies. In pregnant women, low vitamin D levels are linked to preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and adverse pregnancy outcomes. No matter your age or stage of life, having an adequate vitamin D level is very important. Let's start by looking at sample size and how that minimizes error. If you remember, we are trying to learn about a population and a parameter about the population. The parameter of the population is the truth. It's what it actually exists. But a lot of the times, we don't know what the truth will be. For example, if I want to know what percentage of women suffer from vitamin D deficiency, I can't access every single woman in the world or even in the same country in order to conduct this survey. So I'll never really know what the true percentage of that is. However, I can grab a sample and study the women in that sample. But depending on how large my sample is, will determine how much error there will be between the truth and what I estimate the truth to be. Let's take a closer look. Let's look at an example using the same vitamin D deficiency study that I just mentioned. Let's say my question is, what proportion or percent of women in the United States suffer from vitamin D deficiency? And this circle represents all the women in the United States. If I take a small sample, say one this size, the size of this dark green circle, I have a lot of people that I'm not including in the study, right? There's all these people off to the side that I won't be able to study. Let's say that I've decided to take a larger study, represented by this pink circle. Now, I will be closer to the truth. I cover more of those people, so I'm closer to knowing what the truth may be. But I still have a lot of room for error. Let's look at this light green circle. In this light green circle, I'm covering even more of the population. So I'm getting closer to understanding what the true parameter would be, or finding what the true parameter would be. But there's still a lot of room for error. In this dark purple sample, I'm covering even more of the population. So there is less room for error to occur. But unless I get the whole entire yellow circle covered, I won't know the truth. I'm only making an estimation based on the information that's available from the sample. In the case of the dark green sample, I'm going to have a lot of error. In the case of the hot pink sample, I'm going to have less error than there is in the dark green sample, but still there's a lot of error. In the light green sample, I'm going to have less error than I would have had if I would have taken a sample of the pink or of the dark green, but I'm still going to have a lot of error. If I'm able to take a sample the size of the purple sample, I'm going to be closer to the truth, and I'm going to have less error than I would in the light green, pink, or dark green sample. But there's still room for a lot of error because I haven't covered everybody in the population. Let's look at another example dealing with heart disease. Right now, the population of the United States is approximately 328 million. And in 2018, approximately 30,300,000 people were confirmed to have some type of heart disease. That would mean that approximately 297,700,000 people could possibly still have the disease, right? We don't know because they haven't been diagnosed with it. So the only way that the National Institute of Health can know what true proportion of people have heart disease is if they decided to gather up these 297,700,000 people to test them for different types of heart disease. Clearly, it's very difficult, if not even impossible, to reach all 297 million people. But they can do a study, even a large-ish study, using maybe 10,000 people. And while 10,000 is still very, very different than 297 million, they can get some inference of what the true population parameter would be. But ultimately, they're just estimating the truth. In this example, if I wanted to determine if the 297,700,000 Americans that needed to be tested had heart disease, I could conduct different types of sample sizes. If I happen to have a sample with 1 million people in it, huge study, then there would be a lot less error than a study with 10,000 people, because I would be closer to the 297 million that I needed to test. If I got a sample that was 10 million, then there would be even less error than when I had a 1 million size sample, because I'm getting even closer to the 297 plus million that I eventually would need to test to know the truth. If I had a sample that was 100 million, then there would be even less error than when I tested 10 million people, because again, I'm getting closer and closer to the population size of 297 plus million. If I got a sample size that was 250 million, then there would be even less error than when I had 100 million, because I would be getting closer and closer and closer to the 297,700,000 people that would need to be tested to determine the true proportion of people that have heart disease in the United States. As you can see, as my sample size increases, the level of error decreases. So as my sample size N approaches the population size, big N, error decreases. If I were able to obtain 297,700,000 people and test them for heart disease, and then allow for the 30 million that had already been tested, that had been diagnosed with heart disease, then I would actually know the true population parameter of people that have heart disease in the United States. As a sample size increases, the error decreases. Another way to decrease error in your study is to select the appropriate sampling technique. As you're selecting your sampling technique, there are several factors to keep in mind. Factors to consider are which one of the sampling techniques will increase the amount of randomness in your study, which one best suits the data collection process, and which one is within your budget. Sampling bias can occur if the results of your sample are not representative of the population. In other words, if your sample does not have the same attributes as the population that you want to study, it will affect the amount of error in your study. Sampling bias happens when a technique is used that will obtain individuals for the study that favor one part of the population over another. The more bias there is in your study, then the more error will appear in the study. The best way to avoid bias is for there to be some level of randomness in the study. Random sampling is the process of using chance to select individuals from a population to be included in the sample. But what does random really mean? In general, people cannot be random. There's been a lot of research even on why people cannot provide a sequence of random numbers on their own that is truly a randomly generated sequence. In our minds, we like things to be shared out evenly, and the series will generally have fewer runs of the same number. Animals are even random. Even when scientists look at sheep in a paddock or cows in a field, although they're not necessarily lined up, there's usually a pretty similar distance between the animals, and they tend to gather in one section of the field. There's lots of different ways to generate random numbers. A lot of these you might have worked with at some point in your educational career. In elementary school, teachers might use something just like as a spinner to show how probability may work. Of course, there's dice that also demonstrate how probability may work or the chance events. Technology, such as calculators and computer programs, will also generate random numbers. One of my favorite ways to generate random numbers is using random.org, and I will put this information in the description box below. The creators of random.org actually use atmospheric noise to generate a random number sequence. So whenever I need random numbers, I just go into random.org and I can very easily select however many numbers I might need. This way, it keeps me separated from the study and it lessens the amount of bias I might be imposing upon the study. We've just discussed the role of randomness and also the role of sample size in reducing error. These factors will come into play as you also select which sampling technique is most suitable for your study. There are different types of sampling techniques. Each have their pros and cons. What might be good for one study may not be appropriate for another. When you select your sampling technique, you have to always remember the role of randomness. How much can you possibly minimize that bias? How large a sample size you can obtain? And how much money will you have to spend on your study? Let's look at each one of these types in more detail. The best kind of sampling is simple random sampling. Simple random sampling happens when a sample is drawn from a population and each individual in the sample has an equally likely chance of being selected. So here is the population, and 3 people were picked at random. Perhaps after being numbered 1 through 9, 1 through 9 was put in random.org, and random.org selected 3 numbers for you. So every person in this population had an equal chance of being selected. When we think of simple random sampling, the thing that comes to mind is just simple games that you might have played in the past or contests that you might have participated in. When you go into a restaurant and you have a bowl and everybody's putting their business cards in there and one of them gets selected at random, that is simple random sampling. There are factors that can contribute to that. For example, if somebody has a card that is much larger than the other, then there might not be an equal chance of that person being selected. Maybe they have a better chance or they might have a worse chance. In the situation with raffle tickets, like this one right here, they're all about the same size, and there's no one better chance that one number will be selected over another. So putting all of these in some sort of machine where they're just kind of spun around and all mixed up, that would be simple random sampling. There's no bias to it. Another type of sampling technique is a cluster sample. And in that situation, the population is divided into different groups. So, for example, here is a population of 24 people. And these 24 people are put into 6 groups of 4 people. So here's 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups, 6 groups. Instead of selecting 8 people at random from the general population, what's happened here is 2 groups were chosen at random. In my work with educational research, I might work with classrooms and where we want to see if a reading program is effective for, let's say, second graders. So maybe I'm working with a school, and instead of just selecting children at random from all the second graders that are in the school to participate in this reading program, perhaps I just select 3 of the 6 classrooms to have as a treatment group that I'm going to give them the new reading program to work with. And then the other 3 classrooms will have the traditional reading program that the school had been using. And then I can compare groups. But in this case, it would be much easier for me to just grab a whole classroom so that I can monitor and support the teachers as they're working with this new program in their classroom versus just trying to pick children at random from all of the second graders that are at the school, etc. Okay, so it's one way that I can do this. It works nicely for that. Another type of sampling is stratified sampling. And this is when you separate the population into groups that have similar characteristics. So for example, in this situation, here's the population that have men and women. And they've decided to do a stratified sampling technique, and they separated the men into one group and the women into another. This way they could pick 2 men at random and 2 women at random. So they're able to sort of divide the population into groups that will be conducive to their study. If I wanted to do a study on preferred workplace environments for 3 generations of workers, Generation X, Generation Y, and Generation Z, first I want to find people in the population that I can put into these groups. If I do simple random sampling, I would maybe get an uneven amount, or I might just be missing one group altogether. So when I'm looking at a balanced design, when I want the same amount of people from each of the groups, or I want to at least try to do that, stratified sampling is really the best way to go. Another type is systematic sampling. Systematic sampling happens when every so many participants or subjects are selected for the sample. So for example, here they started with person 2, and then they decided that every 3rd person after person 2 would be in the sample. So they picked person 2, person 5, person 8, and person 11. Systematic sampling works really well if you have some sort of like assembly line. So like here, there's these women doing quality control checks on these lipsticks. Here, the same thing with pouring the lipsticks. And here they're creating brushes, or they're checking for how well the brushes were made, etc. Instead of just picking so many of these at random on a certain day, maybe they decide that every 10,000th lipstick they're going to do quality control checks for. They have a system that every 10,000, every 100, whatever they decide to use as their sample, they have a way to conduct sampling that is unbiased, for they can write up the information for whoever is interested in those results. The last type of sampling technique that we will discuss is a convenience sample. And a convenience sample is one where the individuals are easily obtained by the researcher. A convenience sample has the most amount of bias, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad experiment. We just have to note that it has a high amount of bias. Therefore, any results from that study really have to be scrutinized. Whoever is reviewing that information has to make sure that these results are actually coming out of the study. It's not unusual for a researcher to do a convenience sample experiment. After all, if they have access to their own classroom, for example, it's much easier than having to go out into the field and conduct something that is on a larger scale with people you don't know. However, what is professional to do is to actually disclose that information, be able to disclose to whoever is reading this information that you were actually involved in the study and how these participants are related to your field of work, or that they have some level of relationship with you. You have some control over the results, so that when the study is reviewed by other professionals or they try to replicate the study, they understand all the components that went into creating these results. One of the most controversial studies that used a convenience sample was one having to do with childhood immunizations and the vaccine for mumps, measles, and rubella. So mumps and measles are childhood diseases. They used to be very, very common, but as time has gone by, less and less people get the mumps and the measles. And one of the reasons why is because in the 60s and 70s, they were immunizing children with this cocktail vaccine that would protect you from measles, mumps, and rubella. Now, mumps is this picture right here, this little girl right here. There's a gland called the parotid gland, and this gland would swell up. So the children would look like their cheeks were really, really, really big. When children would get the mumps, they would just have a lot of pain kind of in their face, in their head. Typically, it would be difficult for them to swallow. And hearing loss was a harmful effect or an extreme effect of mumps. In this photo, the little boy has measles, and you can see all these little red dots all over him. So measles was another childhood infection that was also caused by a virus, just like mumps was. When people caught measles, they didn't really feel that badly, but it was still a very serious illness. Typically, measles would feel like you had a cold. You'd have a fever, cough, runny nose, sore throat. You would get these little blotches all over you. And you'd have to be separated from everybody because you were infectious. So you couldn't go to school, none of those things. It's very, very highly contagious. Complications from the measles can be an ear infection or pneumonia, or in really bad cases, patients' brain would swell. And then women that were pregnant that came in contact with somebody that had measles, the measles could cause them to go into preterm labor, or the baby could have a low birth weight, and it could even cause death for the mother. So measles was like no joke. As much as they discuss it kind of being like no big deal, measles is a very serious disease. As I said, while it was extremely common before the 60s, in the 60s and 70s, there was a big push to get children vaccinated. Children would get one vaccine called the MMR, Mumps, Measles, Rubella vaccine, and you would be immune to it. You wouldn't be able to catch it. Your body was able to fight off any possible infections. In 1998, the MMR vaccine came under attack. A physician in England, his name was Andrew Wakefield, had done a study that seemed to associate MMR vaccines with autism in children. So you might have even have heard this, where they say children that have vaccines are more likely to have some sort of learning challenges in the future. This is the study that sort of started it all. So in 1998, Andrew Wakefield and colleagues published a paper in the journal Lancet. Now, Lancet is a very famous, very well-known and reputable journal. Wakefield's hypothesis was that the measles, mumps, and rubella MMR vaccine caused a series of events that included intestinal inflammation, entrance into the bloodstream of proteins harmful to the brain, and consequent development of autism. In support of this hypothesis, Dr. Wakefield described 12 children with developmental delay. 8 had autism. All of these children had intestinal complaints and developed autism within 1 month of receiving the MMR vaccine. So what he did is he took 12 children of his own practice, gave them an MMR vaccine, and then he watched them for a particular length of time, right? What was the problem with this? Well, first of all, he had a very, very small sample size, 12 children. And it was a convenience sample, which we know that has lots of bias. So he had 12 children. They were all under his care. He had access to administering the information and also to recording the results. Since that time, his results have never been able to be replicated. So people have tried to replicate this experiment many, many times. It has not been successful. They've never been able to find the same information that this doctor did. Later, when they investigated, they found there was a high suspicion that he was going to receive financial gain by working with the parents of these 12 children to sue the vaccine manufacturers. Further investigation found that he had conducted unnecessary and invasive tests on children without permission. In fact, in one situation, he went to a children's birthday party and gave the children $5 if the children would allow him to draw blood. About 10, 12 years after the study originally came out, so around 2008, 2009, he was stripped of his medical license. So he's no longer a practicing physician. However, since the study, the cases of measles has steadily increased, unless parents are opting for their children to be vaccinated. So this one study that only had 12 kids, and he had controlled all the information himself, got out into mainstream media. And because of this, less children are getting vaccinated. We have more outbreaks of measles. In fact, you see them often on the news where they'll say, Oregon had a big outbreak of measles, or somebody went to Disneyland and had measles, and now all these other people from other parts of the world are getting it, or it broke out in a religious community. If the children were able to get the measles vaccine, or if they continue to give the MMR vaccine, which is a cocktail of all three vaccines, then the instances of measles would have declined enormously. So what's the big idea? Variable selection and sampling methods affect the amount of error in your study. To minimize error, we have to make sure that we increase the sample size as much as possible. Also, we need to make sure that we increase randomness as much as possible because that will decrease bias. The more we decrease bias, the less error we will have in our experiment. So that's it for today. Don't forget to check your emails, check Blackboard, do your homework, and subscribe to this channel. Even better, hit that notification bell so you know when there are new videos for this course. Okay, this is your teacher Tora saying stay safe, and I will be waiting to give you a virtual elbow bump in the next video. Ciao!